What's up? This is Everybody Settle Down. That is Eric Messersmith. I am Charlie Marlow. We are back from a 1 week spring break. Yeah, we're in our 40s. We take spring break trips. No, it's for my kids and for anybody out there working, that if you have your kids off from school, you can't get anything done whatsoever. We took a nice little trip, but we're back to talk some news and politics. Eric, what's up?
Yeah, it's 2 weeks without the show. It's been quite a long gap. I'm fired up, ready to talk about politics, and, it's still Trump versus Biden. We're still at that point, but 2 weeks, you feel like the news cycle goes so fast that if you don't go do the show for 2 weeks, there's a lot of stuff to talk about.
Okay, so let's kick it off. As you said, breaking news. It is still Donald Trump versus Joe Biden as of right now. We think that's still the case. So you sent me the polling numbers. I'll put them up here. Bloomberg Morning Consult poll. So it's the February to March shift. And another shocking breaking news. The polls are tightening. You knew the polls are going to tighten. So basically, Wisconsin going from Trump +4 to Biden +1. So that's a 5 point shift. Pennsylvania, Trump +6 to a tie. So a 6 point move. Michigan, Trump +2 to a tie. So a 2 point move. Nevada, Trump +6 to Trump +2. So Biden picking up 4 points. And the last time we did a show, Eric, I believe we talked about the fact that we didn't see a polling bump from Joe Biden after the State of the Union address, which surprised me. I thought we would. So, what do you think here? Because is it just happening a couple weeks later, or what?
I think it's a I wouldn't call it a bounce. I would call it more like a gradual lunge toward Biden in the polling. It's very subtle, and there hasn't been a ton of polling taken specifically after the State of the Union. So we're still kind of, even though it's been 3 weeks now, we haven't seen a ton of polling. What we have seen is the race hasn't changed dramatically. I would still, to be clear, top line today, I would rather be Trump than Biden. I think if the election were held tomorrow, Trump would probably win. Not a certainty because polling can be wrong, but he's still consistently been very slightly ahead. But if you look a little bit deeper, I think you can see movement toward Biden in especially some of the key swing states similar to this poll. Now, there's good news in here for Trump as well. In this morning consult poll, he's still well ahead in North Carolina, in Arizona, and in Georgia. He has pretty healthy leads in those states. So it's not, again, a dramatic shift, but I think you are seeing a tightening of the race. You're getting it back to where I thought it was all along. I thought it would be once it became more clear that it was a kind of a binary Trump Biden choice for the most part. RFK Jr.'s out there. There's some other candidates. No labels may run somebody. But as we got further along, I think that my default position on this race always was that it's basically 50-50. And Trump has been fairly consistently ahead, maintaining a slight lead. And I think we will move back toward where I think this race was always destined to be, which is pretty close to a toss up. And remember, yes, the overall popular vote polling is important. And if Trump were to win the popular vote, let's say, I think there's almost no chance he would lose the electoral college because there is an advantage in the electoral college for Trump. So if he's ahead by 1 point or 2 points, he's going to win the election. But if not, then it's going to come down to these swing states. And remember, you mentioned Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, and Michigan. In this poll, it had Biden +1 in Wisconsin, tied in Pennsylvania and Michigan. Biden, all he has to do is win those three states. If he wins those three states, as he did in 2020, Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, and then wins all the other states that he is very likely to win, that would give him exactly 270 electoral votes, exactly enough to be the president.
Yeah, and that's where looking at this and heck, I don't know anything, but this is basically what I thought was going to happen, and I still think what is going to happen. Some of these states where Biden was more competitive, or look at Georgia for example. The weirdness of Georgia in 2020, and you had Herschel Walker and all that. I don't see Georgia going to the Democrats very often, right? And so some of these other states that are purplish but more red leans, like the Arizonas, the North Carolinas, even in Nevada. I'm kind of already putting those in the Trump column. And I've thought all along, and I still think it's going to be the case, that this election is going to be, we're agreeing too much here, but it's basically an essential coin flip, and it's going to come down to those blue wall states where typically Biden and the Democrats, should have the advantage, but we saw that Trump turned the tides on those in 2016. So this polling doesn't surprise me. I think it's always going to come down to this. And basically, if Trump can pick off even one of those states, maybe it's Wisconsin. If he could pick off Wisconsin, and if Biden can't hold Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania, it's over. I know it's boring to say this now, but I feel like this is kind of always the direction that we've been going in.
Right. And look, something could happen that breaks it one way or the other. And you could see one of the candidates pull away, not to a dramatic win. I don't think that's possible in our divided politics of 2024, but a win similar to Biden had in 2020, where he won, as you said, traditional Republican territory like Arizona and Georgia, although they were very close margins, but he was able to win those. And that could happen again. On the other side, you could see a situation where Trump sweeps these states, where he does what he did in 2016, which is win Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania narrowly and get Arizona and Georgia as well. But I think what very well could happen is Trump takes the states that have traditionally been Republican, Arizona and Georgia, although they're close. Maybe he also wins Nevada because he's been polling well in Nevada, although it's getting tighter there. But that doesn't have enough electoral votes to swing it. That's not enough for Trump. Even if he flips back Arizona, Georgia, Nevada, that's not enough. He would also have to win one of those three Midwestern, although to Pennsylvania, maybe there's an argument whether that's a Midwestern or Mid Atlantic state. But either way, those
Okay,
three
is it?
states.
Because you're from there.
I'm from Pennsylvania. Yeah, it's funny because where I'm from in Pennsylvania, it's the central part of the state. It's not the Midwest. It's also not the Atlantic. It's like the South. I mean, it's it's culturally more country music, NASCAR, American flags, Bibles. It is more
Really?
like the South where I live. Yeah, but if you lived in
Okay.
Philadelphia, you would probably consider yourself East Coast, and if you lived in Pittsburgh, you might consider yourself Midwest.
Okay. Maybe we go off on a quick tangent here because I've had a million arguments, and you used to live in St. Louis also. So I've lived
Yes.
here now since 2008. I've had a million arguments with people about what St. Louis is. I grew up in Ohio. I always thought kind of the Big Ten country to me was the Midwest, right? The Midwest, Ohio. I always thought St. Louis is very much a tweener. And now it's in the SEC for sports. But I agree with you in terms of, to me, Pittsburgh is Midwest. Clearly, Philadelphia is not. But you bring up some interesting points there. I never would have thought that any part of Pennsylvania, though, would have been like the South. That actually really surprised me when you said that.
Oh yeah, I think it was James Carville, the old strategist, for Bill Clinton, famous political strategist, and he said Pennsylvania outside of the T they call it. So the T of Pennsylvania is the middle and then the top third basically excluding the bottom west corner, which is Pittsburgh area, bottom east corner, which is Philadelphia. And he said that T is basically like Alabama. And there's a lot of truth to that culturally as someone who grew up there.
That's
And that's
interesting.
and politically, that's look. So politically, when I was in Pennsylvania, growing up and covering politics, and I think it's largely true even today, statewide races were often very competitive as they are now. Pennsylvania's been a swing state for a while, and essentially what it was it was a battle between the T, the mainly rural areas, and the margins Republicans could run up there versus what Democrats could run up in the city of Pittsburgh and in Philadelphia. And often it would come down to the Philadelphia suburbs, which are still critically important right now. The Philadelphia suburbs for a while were more Republican, and Republicans did better in statewide races. Lately, with a lot of, as we've seen in the era of Donald Trump, with a lot of suburban areas, they've trended more blue. And as that has happened, Pennsylvania has become more blue. And Pennsylvania has, of course, a Democratic governor. Both of its senators are Democrats as well.
Okay, so I'm looking at a map now. This is funny because, and we'll get back to Trump and Biden. Don't worry, everybody. But as a person who grew up in northern Ohio, where literally the end of my street is the state of Michigan, I've always felt like the Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, especially Illinois and Ohio, it's so much different north to south, right? Toledo feels more like Michigan and it feels more blue. Obviously, Chicago is very blue. But you know this too, because again, St. Louis is right across the river from Southern Illinois. Southern Illinois, Southern Ohio are much more like the South. And I guess I never thought about that with Pennsylvania. But then as I look at the map, I realize you're sharing a nice border there with West Virginia and right there, Southern Ohio. The places I'm saying are clearly very Southern. So it's just interesting because I never thought about Pennsylvania like that.
Yeah, and look, that is what you're gonna be hearing a lot of when we get closer to the election and as returns start to come in, because that's what people watch for. And Trump, I because what happened in 2020 was, if you recall, Trump had a lead in a lot of these states, which played into his conspiracy theories about the election when initial votes were counted, often in more rural areas. And when the urban, because for whatever reason, it's slower in urban areas to count the vote often. And this doesn't even account for mail-in votes, which was another part of the issue, but just it just takes longer. And as those votes came in, think about this, the states that Trump or that Biden won narrowly, right? Philadelphia, these cities, Detroit, Milwaukee, Atlanta, where you have a large number of African Americans. As those margins started to come in really big for Biden, Biden was able to, in a lot of these races, make up the difference and pull into a lead and eventually win those states. Now, it wasn't all because of that, but that is one of the things. And in fact, I heard Trump the other day. There was reporting that he's talking about, especially in areas like Detroit, trying to cut into the black vote because he knows he can't lose that vote in Detroit and Philadelphia and Atlanta 90-10 again if there's a high turnout, because it's tough to make up the margin in the rural areas. He was able to do it in 2016 in some of those states. He was not able to do it in 2020. And then, of course, the third factor is the suburbs. Biden, traditionally a lot of the suburbs, that was, Mitt Romney territory, upper middle class people. Republicans usually did fairly well in the suburbs. Starting in 2016, that flipped. And then you really saw it in 2020 as the parties again realign themselves in recent years, where more upper middle class, college educated people who were maybe moderate Republicans or leaning Republican are now more Biden, on the side of Biden, and more working class voters who for a while were blue collar Democrats are now firmly in the Republican camp.
Yeah, and what you said about how the votes were counted, and I'll be bipartisan in saying this because I remember seeing this, but then also a lot of people replayed it after the fact. I agree that the way the election played out in 2020 with the counting late at night, I understand why people would have conspiracy theories because of the optics of it. You can go back and I'll give you a Republican and a Democrat or an independent technically. Bernie Sanders basically explained exactly how the mail-in ballots were going to be counted before the election started. He goes, "Look, because of the laws in these states, you're going to count the votes the day they come in. All these mail-in ballots, which you know are going to be overwhelmingly Democrat, you can't open those up and start counting them until election day." Bernie Sanders said this, and so did Frank Luntz, as you know, the very
Yes.
popular Republican conservative pollster. He said the exact same thing. And folks who want to check me on this, you can go and you can look up Frank Luntz. He basically, before the election, predicted what he thought was going to happen. He said, when the polls close, Donald Trump is going to be in the lead. He said, but as they start to count the ballots in these more blue areas, and especially the mail in ballots, this was before the election, by the way. He said he believes Joe Biden is going to overtake Trump. And that's exactly what happened. Again, I'm not this person that is a election denier. I understand the optics were really, really bad, but that is what happened. And people on both sides of the aisle laid this out before the election took place.
Yeah, 2 points on that. The first point is, as someone who, again, grew up in Pennsylvania, worked as a reporter in Pennsylvania, covered elections in Pennsylvania, I can tell you pre-COVID, going back decades, it was always a similar pattern in Pennsylvania elections where the early vote tended to favor Republicans and the votes from mainly Philadelphia always came in later. Now, I
Mhm.
don't know, conspiracy theorists will have their reasons for that, but, obviously in Philadelphia, you have a large number of people concentrated in a smaller area. And for whatever reason, processing those votes took longer. That general pattern predated COVID. However, in 2020, that pattern was on steroids in Pennsylvania. And the reason is what you said. And a perfect illustration of this that also dismisses the conspiracy theories is the difference between Pennsylvania and Florida. Both of those states had a large number of mail in ballots. The difference, but Florida's results were in a large chunk of it that night, election night. Pennsylvania took a few days. Why was that? Well, the reason is in Florida, they allow the people who count the ballots to open the mail-in ballots and process and sort them and have them ready to be counted on election day. So when you get to election day, the mail-in ballots in Florida were already ready to be run through the machines. And so they ran them through and counted them that day, the vast majority of them. In Pennsylvania, by law, they could not even open the mail-in ballots until election day. So they had them piled up, couldn't even open them. And again, I'm not trying to be political, but the reason that happened is because the Republicans in the state legislature didn't change the law to allow for the ballots to be processed prior to election day like they did in Florida, even though people warned them, hey, if you don't do this, it's going to create a situation where you're not going to have the results for days and days. And the reason the legislature didn't do that is because they didn't like the changes that were made in 2020 to allow more no excuse mail in balloting as a response to COVID. And so their distaste for that set up a situation where it unfolded the way that it did on election night. And part of the issue for Republicans in 2024, and if you notice outside of Trump, many Republicans are starting to make this argument. DeSantis made it a lot during the primaries, which is mail-in balloting is here now. You may not like it, you may have problems with it, but a lot of the changes that were made in 2020 are still going to be a part of 2024 in terms of mail-in balloting. And Republicans got crushed in mail-in balloting. And they need to do better in banking those votes and getting those votes in ahead of time and embracing the reality of mail-in balloting being more accessible than it has been in the past.
And that's where I think sometimes people don't realize until you really think about it, these margins are so slim in some of these states. They were in 2020, they probably will be again. Now, could you have more fraud with mail in balloting? I agree, you could. I have seen no proof of it on any type of wide scale. But I do think that Republicans need to realize that if you wait until election day to vote, this is anybody. And we're talking about millions of people where if you just have a half percentage or if 1 percentage point of people in a particular state don't vote for whatever reason, there's a million reasons. You could get called into work. You could be sick. Your kid could be sick. You look at how elections can be swung based on the weather. If the weather is really bad, if there's a thunderstorm, whatever it is, again, we're talking about millions of votes, but it comes down to such a small percentage. And if you if you don't vote until election day, you are rolling the dice because look, weird things happen in people's lives. Again, it could be all of a sudden my kid is not going to school, he's sick, I have to call off work, my wife has to do this, something happens, you have to go to the hospital, the weather's terrible. And you might say, oh, that sounds no, there's enough of those weird things in life that can happen that can pick away at the vote percentage if you wait until election day.
I think that's a great point, and it'll be interesting to see as we get closer to the election because Trump obviously has been very anti mail-in voting and railing against it constantly and blaming it for his loss on 2020. But as I said, smart Republicans are saying we have to do a lot better there for exactly the reason you mentioned. If it's close again, which there's no reason as of now to think it will not be, we know that literally tens of thousands of voters in a few states will probably decide this election. That's what happened in 2016. And even with a wider margin, that's what happened in 2020. You flip 100,000 or so votes in a few states, and Donald Trump would have been reelected, even though Biden won the popular vote by 4.5%. So if that happens again, and the odds are it will, that we're very close in a few states, and that is the margin, every little bit matters. And unless your voter is sure they can vote on election day, they're retired or whatever, they live close to the polling station, whatever the case may be, banking that vote in states that allow mail-in is a way to go. And look, mail-in voting has been around. Some states do it as their primary means of voting. I mean, Utah, I believe, Washington State, the majority of their votes are cast by mail. So the idea that mail-in balloting, no matter how you feel about it, it is here to stay, and it is a convenience that people are going to take advantage of. And so, as a political party, you need to try to use that to your advantage to bank as many votes as you can, so you don't leave anything to chance on election day when any number of things could literally change and decide who the next president is in some of these key swing states.
Okay, because we're talking about the 2020 election still and conspiracies and election denying and all that, I do think it rolls into the conversation about Ronna McDaniel, the former head of the RNC, who then gets let go at NBC. And the way I consume content and political content, I love to watch good debates. I love to watch podcasts and YouTube shows that have Democrats and Republicans debating. So I'm all for more people from the other side of the aisle, getting on these shows, whether it's Fox, MSNBC, whatever it is, having opposing viewpoints. However, I do think that this is an interesting time to be alive, I guess you can say, because some people are single issue voters when it comes to Trump, and it does come down to that whole overturning the election. And this is over 50% of the country believes this. And so I would love to sit down and watch just the typical old school debate between a liberal and a conservative, whatever it is about values and all that. But like I also understand why some people on the left, they don't want someone on their show that is an election denier, because for them that's something they can't get past. And I'm kind of like that. I would love to just have the debate about, this gets back to why it bothers me that Trump is running right now. I could care less if Joe Biden wins. If it was Nikki Haley or if it was Ron DeSantis, I'll just be like, hey, just do your thing. Let's watch a normal old school election. I think when Trump comes back, you bring in this fact that, in my opinion, 50% of the country have put their heads in the sand because they want Trump to win and are ignoring what we plainly saw. And that pisses me off. And that's why I just wish it would have been Haley or DeSantis, because now I understand that you don't want the person on your panel who I think is actually lying to themselves. I don't think these folks actually believe themselves that Trump didn't try to overturn the election. I just think they're playing politics. And I hate that. I don't know. What do you think?
When I saw Ronald McDaniel before she was fired, she appeared on Meet the Press Sunday. And it was interesting because she tried to walk back some of the things she has said and done in the past related to overturning the election and commenting on the results from 2020. And one of the reasons she gave is basically that was my job at the time. I was doing my job. I'm willing to accept that explanation for a lot of things. I am, but not that. And I think she's not the worst offender. Like Ronna McDaniel is not, she's not Sidney Powell. She's not Rudy Giuliani. She's not Donald Trump. And I, like you, have such a longing for old school political debate that I think used to be a lot more. It's funny because we have so much more political content now
Mhm.
than we ever have. But I feel like we have less political debate. And part of the reason for that is the content out there has been programmed to bring out one side and make the opinions for one side with very little pushback from the other. And I think as a democracy, we've lost something. And I want to see, for instance, in this case, a pretty liberal outlet like NBC in general and MSNBC specifically have more conservatives on. Like, I think it's crazy. And I don't watch MSNBC all the time, so I may be wrong here, but did they have a regular host or contributor who is a unabashed Donald Trump supporter? I don't know. They should, because half the country, roughly, as we've talked about in this polling, is going to end up probably supporting Donald Trump in this election, and he may be the next president. So my bias is to have more of that, to bring conservatives into liberal outlets, to bring liberals into conservative outlets, to have more moderates on, to have those kind of discussions. Because I think, A, I think they're just more interesting. And B, I think they're much more beneficial for kind of the larger Democratic project. But I do understand when you have someone who, again, she wasn't the worst offender, but if you Ronna McDaniel, she was on the call where Trump pressured two election officials in Michigan to not sign the certification in Wayne County. And at first they didn't. And then under pressure, they went back and reversed. But Ronna McDaniel was on that call. She was on calls where the fake elector scheme was discussed, where Trump and some of his lawyers were trying to efforting putting in fake electors. Now she claims that she thought that was an effort only if the legal challenges succeeded and Trump somehow got states thrown out and then electors would be sat. Even so, when you go down the road, like, I don't have a lot of lines, but when you go down the road of fake electors, schemes to try to overturn the election, I'm just with you. I want a normal politics where conservatives and liberals, Democrats and Republicans can engage in debates and ideas, because both parties have good ideas. Both parties, nobody has a monopoly on the truth and the facts and the great ideas. But I feel like when someone has that aggressively been involved in those kind of efforts, I I can totally understand why people would not want that person as a paid contributor for their network. So I see both sides of this argument.
And that's where this is kind of how I feel about this entire election. I totally understand why people don't want Joe Biden. And I've said a million times Joe Biden is too old, and I do think he's been terrible on immigration. You can make the case that Joe Biden does not deserve to be reelected. I can also make the case that, look, this country is always going to swing back and forth, conservative, liberal, every 4 years, 8 years. We ping pong back and forth, Congress, Senate, whatever it is. I can also make the argument that because of those things I said, it may make sense. Conservatives may deserve to win this election in 2024 based on what has happened to the country. But when I say conservatives, I mean Nikki Haley or Ron DeSantis. All those things I said, I don't believe Donald Trump deserves to be the president for one reason. For one reason. It's the overturning the attempt to subvert the 2020 election. I've said a million times, I think Donald Trump did a pretty dang good job as president. To me, what happened around the election is disqualifying. So the fact that we're basically having a normal election, which is kind of weird when 50% of the country believes the dude shouldn't even be allowed to be on the ballot. And by the way, I have a ton of Republican and conservative friends. A year and a half ago, they wanted Trump to go away. I had
Right.
people who told me, off air on the different shows I have, they'd tell me off air, I kind of want Trump to get caught up legally so he goes away so we have a better
Right.
chance of winning with DeSantis. These are conversations that I was having with my Republican friends a year and a half, a year ago. And now it's like, well, he's our guy. Let's start kind of cleaning everything up again, which that pisses me off.
I agree. I think I've said one of the themes of this podcast is that Republicans I think will live to realize they made a terrible mistake not nominating Nikki Haley if the goal is to win.
Yeah.
And I think one of the things you've seen in recent weeks that has led to the tightening that we've talked about. Again, it's not a surge for Biden, but it is, if you look closely, it is some momentum in his direction. as we settle into this campaign and it becomes a binary choice, what have we seen in recent weeks? We've seen Trump not on the campaign trail. He did a rally in Ohio for a Senate candidate. I think that's the only thing he's done since Super Tuesday. I know he had one rally in Georgia. Whereas Biden, old man basement campaign, has been in every swing state since the State of the Union. Where has Trump been? Well, he's been in court. He was in court Monday. And again, no matter what you think about his various civil and criminal legal cases, that is what is coming down the pike. As hard as he has worked and his lawyers have worked to delay these things, at least in the New York hush money case involving the alleged hush money payments to Stormy Daniels and the campaign finance violations in 2016, the judge was pretty clear the other day that the delays are over and that case is going to trial on April 15th. That's a few weeks from today. I don't know how long that trial is going to take, but let's say it takes 4 or 5 weeks. Trump will be there every day, I assume. It will be in the news every day. It will be leading the news. Biden will be presumably out campaigning. That's the first of potentially 4 trials. Now, I don't think all 4 trials are going to happen before the election, but at least that one looks like it's going to. I think there's a pretty decent chance the January 6th election subversion case will happen before the election as well. So that's another 5-6 weeks. And not only is it spending time, it's spending money. Trump, the part of the reorganization of the RNC that led to Ronna McDaniel needing a job and no longer being in charge is the organization is now intertwined with the Trump campaign, which, by the way, is usually how these things work with a presidential candidate. But when they did that, the fundraising money before it goes to the RNC now will go to a political action committee that is paying Trump's legal bill. So at least some of the money coming in is going to be diverted to pay for his legal bills. Again, if you didn't have Nikki Haley, if you had Nikki Haley, that wouldn't be an issue. The time in court wouldn't be an issue. The chaos that comes with Trump wouldn't be an issue. The comments, the comparing himself to Jesus that happened this week on Easter week, those things wouldn't be an issue. And I think people also forget, and part of Biden's job is going to be try to remind them this year, Trump lost an election before January 6th, before he tried to overturn the election, before there was any subversion of democracy. None of that happened yet in November of 2020, and he lost. And Trump has done a pretty good job, I think, to his credit, of campaigning on his first 3 years, 2017, 2018, 2019, where people say what you will, his approval ratings were not high, but the economy was clipping along at a pretty good pace. Inflation was low. He lost an election before we had any of this other baggage, in large part because of people didn't like the way he handled COVID. And he just generally was not well liked. And there was a general sense of chaos around him. Add all the stuff we've seen then since the election. And so I think the way the last few weeks have played out, it shows you the challenges he's going to have to overcome. Now, again, he's shown himself to be a pretty skilled politician, and he's shown himself to be able to use these lawsuits in a way that can help him, at least in the Republican primary, by claiming he's being singled out. It's part of a conspiracy to keep him off the campaign trail, to drain his time and resources. And so far, he's been able to use that to his advantage. But there's going to come a point where it's no longer a hypothetical. It's actually a court. You're in a court of law. People are under oath testifying. It's evidence. It's cross-examination. That's the story. And I think when it switches from a theoretical, I'm being persecuted, it's lawfare by the Biden administration, into okay, now let's get into the nuts and bolts of what Trump said and did. My personal opinion is that's not going to be as favorable for him, and it's going to be a tougher environment. Again, can he still win the election despite that? Absolutely. I think it's going to be close, but I keep coming back to the polling. When you ask people if he's convicted of a felony, will you support him, particularly as it relates to his efforts to overturn the election? The numbers are not good for him in polling. And you wouldn't have had that baggage had you nominated somebody else.
I was going to save this till the end, but because you brought up Donald Trump comparing himself to Jesus, you have the Trump Bibles being sold, and when I saw that, first thing I thought of, and look, I'm not a religious person. My wife is, and hey, I hope all that, and there's a heaven and all that, and I hope I get there. I'm just not sure, and I don't know. But what I find so funny is, like, I always remember that clip I guess was it 2015 or 16 when the dudes are interviewing Trump and they're like, "What's your favorite Bible verse?" And he couldn't name one. And then they're like,
Yes.
"Do you like?" By the way, I probably couldn't either. Really, I could say John 3:16. I remember that one from Stone Cold
Right.
Steve Austin. But they said, "Do you like the?" And by the way, I took a whole class in college, the history of the Hebrew Bible, and I can't remember hardly any of it. But they asked him, "Are you more of an Old Testament guy or a New Testament guy?" And he's like, "Both." And this is what I would say if I was asked a question like that. If I'm having to pretend to be religious when I'm not, and again, I'm gonna both sides this one. The fact that you have to pretend, like we know Donald Trump isn't religious, and that's fine, by
Wait,
the way.
how do you know that, Charlie? Are you certain?
If you can't name, if he's pushing 70 at the time and he can't name one Bible verse, and by the way, I can't really either, but I don't pretend to be religious. On the other side, I'm sure there's been some Democrat presidents who are probably atheists or agnostic, but they couldn't admit it because it'd be bad politically. And I just think it's all part of this show. Everybody has to pretend. It's so stupid to me.
Well, it's more than a show though. Now it's it's money, right? I mean, look, he's
Yeah.
licensing his name to sell these Bibles for $60. In the Truth Social post, he said he has many Bibles at his home. And I mean, so if you went to Mar-a-Lago, you would probably find a lot of Bibles around. And he says he reads it often. So I mean, maybe he's in his later years become a more religious man. I don't know. I mean, again, in a few weeks, we have the Stormy Daniels hush money payments trial coming up. It's a God, it's a weird time. You talked about it before. It's like in some ways, it's a typical election. It's the typical stuff we talk about: immigration, abortion, taxes, spending, what states matter, strategy, getting out your vote, the states that it's going to come down to. But in the other ways, you have this kind of weird sideshow stuff that is totally not normal. So you have these two things existing at the same time, which is why it's so freaking fascinating this year because you have the totally normal political stuff the political nerds get into like us, and then you also have all this like mind-blowing ridiculous stuff on the side as well that just got kind of, for selfish reasons, I'm glad it's there because it's interesting, right? It's something to talk about. But, do you really believe that Trump is sitting at Mar-a-Lago, after a round of golf, after he wins the club championship, which he bragged, congratulations for that. He's, cracking open a Bible and reading John 3:16. Personally, I have my doubts about that, but I'm not there. So I can't confirm or deny.
And I know I'm repeating myself now, but this is what is so crazy to me about this election. And this is why I wanted a Haley or a DeSantis. So many people really believe, truthfully, that Donald Trump tried to overturn the election and thus should be disqualified from even running. And then we have to go about it, people have to go about it and have these normal policy debates, right? And pretend like that didn't happen. It's insane to me. That's
It
the only
is.
time this has ever happened. If DeSantis or Nikki Haley was running, people wouldn't think like this. I think a lot of people in the middle would even be like, you know what? Nikki Haley, Ron DeSantis are fine. Joe Biden's old. It's all good. But we're having these policy debates when over 50% of the country, and I actually think almost everyone, I think they just won't admit it, really don't think Donald Trump should be able to run because of what happened around the 2020 election. Yet we have to pretend like it didn't happen and have a normal race. It's insane to
Right.
me.
It is. And I think we'll look back when we get into the 2028 race at these elections, particularly this one, and we'll shake our head and I hope that is the case. I hope we will go back to a more normal time in the future, but we're not there now. Getting back to something you said earlier, I wanted to make we talk about Trump and the Bible and the obvious jokes we can make there. But I think to the larger point of what you said, I think you're right in terms of religion needing to be acknowledged in a forceful way for candidates for high office in the present or in the past and even in the present. But I think that will change in the future. I really do. If you look at the polling of the percentage of Americans who say they are unaffiliated, which is the fancy term for I don't go to church and I don't really believe in an official religion, that number is rising fairly precipitously, especially among young people who obviously will be, the voters of the future. And so I think that in a certain X number of years, that will be much, much less of a factor than it is now. And candidates who, let's just say, maybe aren't the most religious individuals will feel less of a need to pay lip service to something. And again, I want to be clear, I have no problem with anybody believing or not believing whatever they want, and no problem with, people who are very religious making it a part of their identity and a part of their campaign. No problem whatsoever. What I do have a problem with is people who are clearly not religious in any way and don't act in a way that matches up with the tenets of said religion, using it as a way to try to ingratiate themselves with voters who do actually believe in the tenets of that said religion.
Right. And that's where you can even wrap this into kind of the strategy of politics. It doesn't bother me at all when people talk about their religion whatsoever. But I do think that here's where the Democrats need to clean up a lot of things. There's a lot of Democrats who are religious. Now maybe, you know, the far left progressives, maybe that's not part of their platform, but I feel like the Democrats have kind of ceded any type of religious argument to Republicans. Anything to do with the flag and patriotism, I feel like that's all for the Republicans now. You can even talk about immigration, where, back in the day, it was very bipartisan for a Democrat president to talk about the need for a strong border. We've all seen the Clinton speeches, and it's almost like, okay, so because Republicans are going to be more religious, oh, Democrats now can't be, because Republicans are going to be the guys that have the flags and the pins on their chest. Oh, Democrats aren't going to fly a flag. Oh, because immigration is a better issue for Trump and the Republicans, we're going to ignore immigration. A lot of this stuff was just kind of normal stuff, and I feel like from a strategic standpoint, the Democrats, those that are religious, should embrace that. Those that want to wear the flag pin and fly the flag in front of their house and talk about patriotism should embrace that. We need to get back to where everybody said we needed a strong border. And you're not just going to, oh, wait, Trump's really good and really strong on the border. We got to be the opposite. No, why don't you actually join him in being strong on the border? And then you take away his best policy issue and you negate it by agreeing.
I think part of politics and part of the campaign is not only playing to your strengths, but you have to attack the other person's strengths as well. You're absolutely right, because if not, you cede those issues to them without a fight. And I think, for instance, the issue you brought up, immigration, is a good example. Biden isn't going to win that issue, and for good reason. I don't think he's done a very good job at the border. That's Trump's best issue. I saw a poll the other day on that issue. Trump did better than any other, but the margin was huge. It was like plus 40 over Biden on who do you trust more to handle immigration. It was by far Trump's best issue. But if you're Biden in that particular issue, I think you have to go at him and you have to say, look, his position, what is his position on the dreamers? Does he really want to have mass deportation of people that have been here for 30 or 40 years? Do we want to round up, grandmothers who have been in America for 30 years and deport them back to a country they've never known? What does he think about legal immigration? What about the compromise bill that was worked out among the Biden administration and Senate negotiators that called for reform on the asylum laws that Trump essentially single-handedly killed by voicing his opposition to it? You've got to attack him there on what are his strengths. And if you're Trump, you got to do the same thing as well on what are perceived to be Biden's strengths. Abortion, you've got to come out with a reasonable position there. Healthcare. I saw a Truth Social post from Trump the other day where he wrote, "I am not going to try to repeal the Affordable Care Act." I had not heard him say that before. That he talks about making it better, but he, while he was president the first time, he did try to repeal it, and it almost passed. I don't know if you remember the famous John McCain giving the thumbs down on the Senate floor. That was essentially the vote that saved Obamacare from being repealed. And now Trump is saying in a second term, he wouldn't try to do what he did in his first term, which was repeal the ACA, which I think is very smart strategy for Trump and shows what you're talking about, which is not conceding an area of supposed strength of the other campaign, but going in and trying to fight for that ground.
Okay, so RFK Jr. picks his VP. It's not going to be Aaron Rodgers. It's Nicole Shanahan, this attorney and entrepreneur. And what do you think about RFK Jr.? I think with him, it's been funny to watch the media coverage where again we live in these different silos where this guy, if you're a podcast YouTube guy, you've seen him. He's been on every single podcast with his wife Cheryl, who I love from Curb Your Enthusiasm, by the way. They've been
Yes,
doing all
absolutely.
the podcasts. He sits down, he'll talk for 2 hours, 3 hours, whatever it is. But then on the cable news, where a lot of people, older folks, are watching that, you saw that at first Fox News was friendly to him, and then they turned on him. And if you look at the polling, I haven't looked really recently, but consistently it seemed like every time you threw RFK Jr. into the polls, it was 2 points better for Trump. And so you probably saw the other day CNN went after him. So it's kind of funny. I still think I think RFK Jr. is very likable. I think if he actually could debate, be up there with Trump and Biden on several debates, I think he's going to get a huge percentage of the vote. I don't think he's going to win by any means. Hopefully, down the road, a third party could actually win. But if we actually have debates and you see old Joe Biden and Donald Trump, and they're both nuts and they're kind of crazy, and then you see this very measured, I know his voice is rough, but you see this very measured RFK Jr. He said some crazy things, we know that, but also his messaging for this election cycle, it's very to the middle of the country. It's very much about compromising. You don't see a lot of that with the other guys. So I don't know, I think he can get a huge vote total, to be honest with you.
Yeah, I mean, a couple things. First of all, he's an old guy too, although not quite. I think he's almost 70, right? But he
No,
looks
he can do
spry like a spring
push-ups.
chicken.
He can do
Right.
push-ups.
Yes, he can do push-ups. As long as you can do push-ups, it doesn't matter how old you are. Yeah, the latest our Real Clear Politics average. So and you mentioned his effect on the race. Trump Biden head to head, Trump is ahead by 1.1. Five-way race that includes, of course, RFK Jr. with also Jill Stein, the Green Party candidate, and Cornel West, who says he's running as independent. Trump plus 2.7. So that's not a huge difference, but that is enough. As we've said, if your prior is the election's going to be close, that is more than enough to change the result. And in the average of the polls, Kennedy's getting 10% right now in the average. Some polls he's up in the mid-teens, some he's down in the single digits. So it's a wild fluctuation, but you average it out, it's around 10 points. So we talked about earlier, what is the prior way you kind of your default, how you look at this election? Mine, big pictures, it's going to be really close. It's a 50-50 race. When my prior of how I view Kennedy has been, he's an interesting candidate. He will fade as it gets closer and he gets more media scrutiny and the other two campaigns begin to attack him, which really has just now started to happen. And most people realize it's going to be a binary choice between Trump and Biden. My prior is he will slide down to somewhere around 5%. But even if I'm right, that's still enough to swing the election.
I disagree
5%,
with you.
you think it's going to be higher?
Well, I disagree with you in the sense I think he's going to go the opposite. I really do. I think if he's at 10 right now and you think he's going to go to 5, and again, I want to couch this by saying I need to see him debating Donald Trump and Joe Biden. We need to have actual debates because I do think that if you're I keep repeating myself, if you're a podcast guy for 2 years straight, you've heard nonstop RFK Jr. and Vivek. And I don't think that the general public who watch cable news or network news, they haven't seen RFK Jr. in the way that people that watch non-traditional media. So if you talk about 3 debates, prime time, where everybody's watching, where he's up there, if that happens, we should make a nice little friendly bet here. I bet you it's more like he goes from 10 to 15, in my opinion.
Okay. And either way, no matter what it is, it's enough to definitely swing the result. And if the polling is accurate, he hurts Biden slightly worse than Trump. But again, as you mentioned, he's not easy to fit into our left right liberal conservative Republican Democrat paradigm we have. He has kind of idiosyncratic views, so he does pull votes from both people. There are a lot of Trump people, anti-vax people, the anti-COVID vaccine people that are very drawn to him. And so I think it will be interesting to see what I'm watching for. You're right. The debate will be, I mean, if he can if he can qualify for the stage, because I think there will be debates. It's not a certainty by any means, but I think it's more likely than not we will have debates. The question to me is, what will the threshold be polling wise for an independent candidate to get in? That will really, I mean, that's going to be the ball game. One other point on RFK: ballot access. It is not a given that he is on the ballot. In fact, right now, the only state I believe he's confirmed to be on the ballot in is Utah. His people have claimed they've gathered enough signatures for a few others. And of course, that is one of the reasons he named his vice presidential candidate this week so early, is because in several states, I think it's around 24, in order to get on the ballot as an independent, you have to have a vice presidential candidate. So the next few months, we need to see how many states does he get on the ballot on, and number two, is he on in the swing states? Because it's extremely unlikely he wins an electoral vote. I mean, Ross Perot got 19% of the vote in 1992 and did not win a single state. So the getting 10, 15% is one thing. Winning a state is a completely different ballgame. I think it's very unlikely he wins a state. But if he's on the ballot in Michigan and Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, the states we talked about at the beginning, and he's getting 5, 10, 15%, that I think it's going to be really tough for Biden, especially when you throw in Jill Stein getting 1 or 2%. You throw in Cornel West. He also needs to get on the ballot. But if he's on the ballot getting 1 or 2% of the anti-war vote, the pro Palestinian vote in Michigan, where you have a lot of Arab Americans, for instance, that's enough to swing the election to Trump. And it's not a direct correlation, but I think 2016 and 2020 give us some data to look at in relation to 2024. In 2016, Trump and Clinton combined for about 94% of the vote. 6% almost went to somebody else. A lot of that was Gary Johnson, who was running as a libertarian. You had Jill Stein again in the Green Party. You had a 0.5% of people, which is a huge number of people, writing somebody in. I mean, think about that. That's a lot of people. That's a 0.5% of whatever it was, 130 million, wrote somebody's name in. So Clinton and Trump getting around 94%, Trump wins. Fast forward to 2020, Trump and Biden combined got over 98% of the vote. So your third party write-in vote, somebody else, went from roughly 6% to roughly 2%, and Biden wins. I don't think that's a coincidence. I think in general, the more people that vote, RFK, Jill Stein, Cornel West, write-in, the more likely Trump is to win. And so if you're Biden, not only do you have to worry about Trump, you have to go after these candidates, and not necessarily aggressively, but you've got to make the case that a vote for Jill Stein, Cornel West, and even to some extent RFK Jr. is a vote for Donald Trump. And I think you're going to see Biden and his surrogates make that case very dramatically. And they have some ammunition. I mean, remember, a large chunk of the Kennedy family has come out against RFK Jr. publicly. So you can trot them out in campaign commercials, at the convention, on the stump, to kind of remind people, hey, you may think the Kennedy name means something in Democratic politics. This isn't JFK, okay? This is not his father, Robert Kennedy Sr., and here is why. And so I think you're going to see that case made. And from Trump's side, I thought it was interesting. This is what Trump said in a statement about RFK Jr. Yesterday. RFK Jr. is the most radical left candidate in the race by far. He's a big fan of the Green New Deal scam and other economy-killing disasters. I guess this would mean he's going to take votes from crooked Joe Biden, which would be a great service to America. That's going to be how Trump frames him. Trump is going to frame him as a left-wing radical on the environment, for mainly because he said the quiet part out loud. He wants people who are considered to be left-wing radicals to vote for him and not vote for Joe Biden. So you clearly see the Trump strategy of how he is going to attack RFK Jr. I think we're going to see the Biden strategy of attacking him in the coming weeks, assuming he can get on the ballot.
What you said earlier about the percentage, I think is really interesting because if we look at it from a narrative perspective, take yourself back 8 years, 2016. I remember everybody saying, so many people saying, I hate these two choices, right? This is before Trump had a pretty good presidency where he kind of united the Republican Party for 2020. So 2016, the narrative was, how are these our only two choices? Nobody likes Hillary. Nobody likes Trump. Are you kidding me? So I can see why, with some other candidates, the percentage would be lower. Then 2020 happens. Now, COVID's crazy, but I think, again, Trump united Republicans and said, hey, this guy did a pretty good job. For Democrats, it was more about, okay, Joe Biden is not our favorite number one choice, but we have to beat Donald Trump. That was the narrative. I feel like in 2024, we have gone back to the narrative of 2016 of America hates both of these choices. I do think there will be more people who don't vote for either, or RFK, or go third party, or don't vote at all, or leave it blank, or write in their Uncle Johnny as a joke for president. I do think that's going to happen more in 2024. I think it's going to be more like 2016.
I think as the election gets closer, it's going to become clear that this is maybe Biden's biggest electoral problem, even more so than his age and inflation and immigration, is having so many other choices. Again, the big assumption is they can get on the ballot. Can Kennedy and Cornel West get on the ballot in the key states? It doesn't matter if they're on the ballot in California. If RFK Jr. gets 15% of the ballot and vote in California, it doesn't matter. In Texas and Florida and New York, his percentage isn't going to matter in those states because it's not going to affect the outcome. And all that matters is the electoral votes.
Mhm.
But let's use Michigan as the example. If he's getting 10% in Michigan, and then Jill Stein and Cornel West, who are, let's be honest, they're very unlikely to be taking any Donald Trump votes, right? I don't think there's a person deciding between Donald Trump and Cornel West, but there is a person I can envision them in Michigan who's very much against, what Israel's done in Gaza, and very much against how the Biden administration has handled that. I can definitely envision that person debating between Biden and Cornel West or Jill Stein. And if West and Stein combine for, say, 4 or 5%, and RFK Jr. is getting 10 or 15, that's going to be really tough for Biden to win a state like Michigan, in my opinion, if that happens. I wouldn't say impossible, but it's going to be really hard because Trump is going to have his 40% in these states that's going to be with him. Trump has I think he's your typical, to use a sports analogy, he's your low floor, high floor, low ceiling candidate. I think that's what Trump is. He's going to be in a range. It's not going to go lower than that range. It's not going to go higher. And that's going to be the mark he's going to hit. And if you're Biden, it's going to be tough to get over that high end mark if you have these other candidates nipping at your heels, getting significant percentages of the vote.
Donald Trump, he's your St. Louis Cardinals. He's until last year. Last year they sucked,
Yeah.
but most
Yeah.
years super high floor. You're thinking minimum 84 wins, but after their great run from 11 to 15, it was always like the ceiling was always like 88, 89. The fans want more. Oh, that's Donald Trump. Look at from the popular vote standpoint. I believe his ceiling is 47%, and that's two times basically. And I'm talking popular vote. It's going to be hard for Donald Trump to surpass 47. It's probably going to be impossible. Again, if RFK Jr. is on the ballot, there's no chance. And again, you can look at some of these polls where, I don't know, Trump could win with probably 43% of the vote if it's 43, 42, whatever, and if an RFK Jr. gets 10% or whatever it is.
Yeah, absolutely. The margin needed, the percentage needed goes way down when you have viable third party candidates. And like I said, in 2016, the total write-in third party candidate was 6%. The total. RFK Jr. himself very well may exceed that. You're saying you think he may double that. If that's the case, then the percentage you need to win some of these states is going to be pretty low. And I think in general, it's not necessarily 100% intuitive because of the fact that RFK does have some support from Trump leaning individuals as well. But in general, the polling backs this up. If he does very well, RFK Jr., I think that's bad news for Joe Biden. Potentially fatal news in terms of him winning these key swing states.
I wonder too, because I'm kind of going through this myself here. You said this earlier about it doesn't matter his percentage in California and Texas. I agree with that. I also wonder if I think voters think like that. For example, I don't want Biden. I don't want Trump. And it's very easy for me in 2024 to say I'm not going to vote for either of those as I live in the state of Missouri where a
Yeah.
Democrat has no chance of winning. In the same way of if you want to vote for an RFK Jr. in Texas or in California, it really doesn't matter. It'll be nice for his vote total. We can talk about that, but you have no chance of swinging that actual state. I wonder, this is where if I was living in a true swing state, like I lived in Michigan 3 different times. I lived in Ohio when it actually was more of a purple state, but I do think that people have a different mentality when they realize it's going to come down to just potentially a couple thousand votes. Like the way I look at this presidential election, it would be different if I was living in Michigan than me right now in Missouri where my vote doesn't really matter. Let's be real.
Yeah, you're right. Voters understand this. Voters are sophisticated enough, and the media tells them enough what are the important states and what aren't, that nobody's confused. And so let me amend something. I want to correct something I said earlier, a prediction. I don't know. When I say 5%, I'm specifically thinking of the important states. I
Okay.
don't think Kennedy gets over 5% in states that matter for the reason you're citing, which is the voters in those states know that if they vote for Kennedy, they're essentially wasting their vote. Again,
Mhm.
barring that 1 in 1,000 chance that Kennedy like surges and he's all of a sudden got a real threat to win, right? I'm excluding that as a possibility, but who the hell knows, right? We live in weird times. But putting that possibility aside, if the polling is roughly as it is now going into the election, I just can't imagine voters in Michigan and Wisconsin and Pennsylvania knowing that either Trump or Biden is going to be the president in a few months, voting for RFK in big numbers. So when I say 5%, I mean in the swing states, the states that really are going to decide this election. I don't think he'll get 5. I could see maybe in some states where, as you said, voters know they essentially have a free pass to vote for Kennedy because it's not going to swing the result. In those states, I could see him getting what look like pretty healthy percentages.
There you go. All right, I was gonna say let's end on that. I want to talk about how I think the world is more negative post COVID, but let's save that for next week. Let's save the negativity for next
Yes.
week. I always
No
like to
negativity on this podcast.
right. I do this baseball podcast. You can check out. It's called Low Hanging Fruit with Brendan Schaefer. At the end of the podcast, I always like to tell him, why don't you empty your notebook? So, Eric, is there anything in your notebook that we didn't get to that you feel like you need to touch on?
Oh my gosh. You know what's interesting is I think we have hit pretty much everything in this episode. I don't think I have anything else. No, we covered it all. I tell you, that was a very thorough breakdown of everything.
Love it. All right. Well, thank you, Eric. Thanks everybody for watching. Please comment, like, subscribe, and rate the show on podcast and YouTube here. Let us know in your comments. We got to get to the viewer comments and start reading some of those. That's my fault. I'm going to do better about that. But share the show, share the channel on social media, put it in your group text. Let's get this thing going. Eric, good stuff. Great to be back after a week off, and we'll see you next week.